The half of the tribe put in the garden was a tribe called the Amorites. They are the ones who received genes from the original experiment by those from Sirion and Venus. They ate the food from the garden and also received spiritual teachings. They were from the house of David, remember, the same as a Jewish race, but were not part of the Israel nation. As far as what happened to this half of the tribe, they were taken from the garden after 3 generations and put in the land of Moab, where they were watched for another 3 generations, and at that time were released from their bondage and told to go into the world and mix with all others. They did as they were told. They eventually went across the land bridge and into America, but they were not the Indians. They were the survivors of Lemuria and eventually mixed and mated with the Indians. Not all of them, of course, took this trek. There are still a goodly number of them in Egypt and are the instigators of the fighting there at this time. This is called the Aryan race today, this half of the chosen tribe. The entire Aryan race on Earth today is a mixture of both the animal man experiments and the offspring of outer spacemen. To be Aryan means to have evolved with help from outer space. These Amorites truly were the chosen race, and their history is what should be traced at this time. The Amorites were closely controlled, and the records of their testing are hidden in the caves in the desert area around Moab. This is where the proof will be found that the chosen race was not what is known as the Jewish race today. The Jewish race was part of the chosen tribe, true, but was not the half of the tribe chosen to receive all the help. The other 6 original tribes, along with the half of the tribe of David, were the biblical lost tribes of Israel, and are the ones who were not allowed in the garden. The ones who were not allowed in the garden were considered lost as far as the spacemen were concerned. Not lost in a literal sense of the word, only in a spiritual sense. They were the ones the captain, the Lord, did not choose to aid, the ones he left to make it on their own. The captain had driven them out of the garden, which was, remember, an experimental garden for aiding evolution. He had to have a test case to compare against those helped by the garden food. No experiment could be considered accurate without being done this way. More help had been called in from other planets, and the other races were started. At that time they did not want a mix of these races, and as some of the other planets' skin was the same color as those in the garden, they felt that circumcision was a very exacting way to set those not allowed in the garden apart from those who were allowed. This is why the captain gave orders to circumcise any that lived with the half of the tribe not allowed in the garden, whether of their blood or not. The spacemen wanted no tainting of their test case in the garden by any others. All the races became mixed, and many shades of all colors began to appear, except for the Jewish race, which included the half of the tribe of David not allowed in the garden, plus the other 6 original tribes. What happened is that the other 6 tribes mixed with the half of the tribe not allowed in the garden, and the spacemen lost their test case. At this time, the practice of circumcision became widespread among all the other 6 tribes. They stayed true to themselves for many centuries, for several generations, so the spacemen still had a fairly accurate testing for approximately 6 generations. For this reason, it has unwittingly been an ongoing experiment. When they lost their test case was the point at which there was no longer any need to keep the tribes apart. Therefore, it was no longer necessary that they be circumcised. The experimental garden was helping. The huge animals had already been taken care of before the restructuring, so there were no longer any large animals. The spacemen introduced fire and the wheel. Fire was an awesome thing to men at the time. They were, of course, frightened by it and held it in awe and fell down and worshipped it when they saw it. It would literally incapacitate them until finally, through many hundreds of years, they learned to use it. Try to picture teaching a cat nowadays not to be afraid of fire. The period of low tide on the Red Sea was a time of drought and famine in Egypt. The crops wouldn't grow, the waters dried up in the sea, and the fish lay dead and stinking on the shores, causing disease. Many tried to eat the dead fish because they were starving. They became ill and died. It was truly a time of terrible trials in the land. The spacemen knew that they had to get the people to greener pastures, the biblical 23rd Psalm. They convinced the people that they would be better off in the land known as Sinai because of its fertile valleys where the new crops could be grown more easily. When they came to the Red Sea, the water was at an all-time low, and there was a sandy bar 3/4 of the way across. The spacemen sandbagged, so to speak, the rest of the way so that the people could walk the whole distance across. They knew that they could never get the people into the spaceships because of fear. They decided to guide them with smaller ships that are stored under the big motherships, similar to lifeboats on ocean-going vessels. They led the people there at night using lights which the men thought were fire. The spacemen sandbagged, so to speak, the rest of the way so the people could walk the whole distance across. By sandbagging, I mean just that. The use of some bags filled with sand was enough to dry up a ridge through the center for the people to cross, the biblical parting of the Red Sea. Once on the other side, they were left again with adequate seed for planting, to fend for themselves. They had to learn to stand on their own. They had found a leader for these people, biblical Moses, but like a wise parent, the spacemen knew that they had to let this child grow and learn and discover and do or not do things on his own. When they left, they knew they would be gone for a long period of time. This is when they left orders or guidelines for Moses to help his people, the biblical 10 Commandments. They were universal laws, worded in a simplistic manner. When the ships left, they did not return for 300 years, during which time Moses and his people faced all sorts of problems from nature. Some they brought on themselves by not treating the land with respect, planting the same crops over and over in a field depleted of nutrients in the ground. Some they had no control over, such as the locust. The guidelines were given to Moses from a spaceship called Orion over a speaker system as the ship was getting ready to depart. This is why it was on a hill, as most landings and takeoffs succeed better when done on a high spot. This is true even today. The guidelines eventually evolved from simple statements and explanations to cruel guidelines. For instance, "Thou shalt not commit adultery" was meant in application to the land. This one commandment, above all others, has caused much fear and guilt in people. The meaning applied to it today fell into the category of "do unto others," and so on. The commander of the ship, the captain, the biblical Lord, left these guidelines for Moses to help him in his leadership of the people. They knew they would have to leave him for a period of time as a testing of his abilities. When the spacemen returned, Moses was still alive. The spacemen saw to that, as they knew he would be needed until they could get back. These were guidelines given to the race at that time period. There is a new set of guidelines in place for the race where it is now. There will be new guidelines for the race where it is 50 or 100 years from now. The guidelines must continue to evolve along with the evolving of man. The Book of Numbers is not understood by humanity today because it was in a code so the space fathers could know the results of their experiments. There is an accurate record of the names of those who were experimented on, the biblical Book of Numbers. The space fathers kept records as far as their test case and their pure experiment, the two halves of the tribe known as the House of David. This book is not understood by humanity today because it was in a code. If it were interpreted in this manner, it would be proof positive to humanity of what is being written here, of the help that came from Venus. No one ever really understood this book, therefore there was no tampering done to it. It is the only proof of the space fathers' experiments that has not been tampered with. It has not been tampered with because it was not understood as to what it truly meant. Therefore, by the grace of the non-illumination of all down through the ages, this book has been preserved as the only way humanity will ever come to believe in their double evolution, spiritual and physical. Therefore, I believe this book of Numbers should be gone over with a fine-tooth comb and interpreted the way it should be. There is one piece of knowledge that would most likely help humanity in their understanding of our origins. This knowledge is the fact that the captain, biblical Lord, referred to in these early books, was not the same captain as the one in later books. This first captain was a mean, jealous man who, due to the power he had over these simple folks, set himself up deliberately to be worshipped by these people. He had more power than the greatest in the world today, and he used it. This was unfortunate, and it has been a cause of a lot of our problems today. He needed to use a tight rein with these poor half-animals, half-men that were the results of the experiments of his planet. He had to be firm with them. It had to be this way, as it still has to be this way with those in charge of armies, for the sake of discipline. They had to have guidelines. This all had to be done. But then it was overdone. Do not misunderstand. This first captain did what he had to do in the beginning to follow up on the experiments of the artificial inseminations with genes from his planet. He did this in a firm, loving, and kind way in the beginning, but then it went to the point where he enjoyed making these poor folks cringe and bow down before him. This first captain misused his powers as far as having complete control over these people. He was removed as captain of the fleet, and the Space Fathers reappeared with a new captain in charge. The first captain was taken back into his cycles for a rest and truly set back in his evolution. He had to repeat many lessons. He did not reincarnate onto the Earth plane, but he did serve the inner planes of our Earth, trying to help undo some of the wrongs he had caused. When these early people then passed from the Earth plane, he worked with them, paying off his karma. Of course, the poor simple folk did not realize the difference between that first captain and the second, because there was a long time period before a return was made. The people feared this new captain because of the stories and tales passed down about the first captain. The new captain tried to change the image the people had of the one they called their lord. He tried to change this into an image of a loving father. He has been trying ever since to undo the harm to the people of his planet caused by the first captain toward the end of his mission. This new captain did not try to make the people understand that he was a different lord. There was no way he could make them understand this at that time. I believe this piece of knowledge can help unravel some of the discrepancies passed down through history. The new captain of the fleet, the biblical Lord, made several appearances at that time, and he did glow with light. He glowed as we today cannot glow, partly because of the pure atmosphere then, combined with his electromagnetic field, his energy. Also, he amplified his voice, biblical references to the Lord speaking. This was done by an electronic encoder that transformed the language of the captain, the biblical Lord, into the speaking language of the people, who at that time also used a partial sign language. Another new captain of the spaceship will arrive soon to change the image of the last captain of the ship, the biblical Jesus. This last captain, Jesus, wanted to come down and walk the land with these people who were the results of his forefathers' experiments. He felt that they had not been given enough help at that time. The whole experiment was similar to breeding a superior strain of horse or other animal that is done now. It is still going on. Other planets bred other races. There are more experimenters coming in from other planets, artificially inseminating other tribes of the same two-legged animal that those from Venus were experimenting with. The American Indians were evolved at the same time as the experiments in Israel, only by ships from the planet Sirion, thus the red-skinned race, as this was the color of those from Sirion. The other races were also evolved at the same time from ships from other planets. It was a well-planned experiment, but went awry in the sense of the word, as there were to be 7 experimental spots on the planet at the same time. Only 5 of them responded. Life started at these 5 preordained spots on the landmass. There is a gap in where the other 2 brothers did not respond to the plan. Life in these 2 areas, present-day Antarctica and Africa, did not evolve as fast due to lack of insemination experiments in the early stages from the 2 brothers who did not respond. They were helped in later experiments, but are behind in evolution. This help came from the same planets, Pluto and Orion, that helped before, thus the black Atlantean and the black African, and the yellow Chinese and the yellow Eskimos. Therefore, we have the brown race, if you care to call it that, the red, the yellow, and all shades in between. The Essenes were, and still are, the teachers of Earthlings. They have always been the teachers throughout our history. They eventually were the teachers of Jesus. The Essenes were the original experimenters from the planet Venus who kept a colony on Earth to help their experiments. They were the original source of the guidelines, the biblical 10 Commandments given to Moses. They mainly were, are, and always will be more interested in the 2 halves of the chosen tribe instead of the other 6 tribes. This group from Venus stayed and colonized the Earth from the time of their first experiments on. They did not all stay and intermix and intermarry. They put in a term of service and returned to their homes, and a new group replaced them. But there was always a carryover. The Essenes were a grouping that has reincarnated together many times since then. They came in together in the Quaker period also. This group has always been more evolved than most. They are the pioneers now for the new creation. They were and still are the teachers of earthlings. They have always been the teachers throughout our history. They eventually were the teachers of Jesus. They initiated the tribes of Israel into the teachings that would enable them to recognize the one who had received the Christ consciousness. Without this initiation, the people would not have known the signs pointing to Jesus as the one. The other 6 of the 7 original tribes were eventually inseminated with genes and taught by the Essenes and brought abreast of spiritual teachings. Their lineage has been preserved and their progress followed. They have nearly caught up with the others in all areas except knowing spiritual truths. Instead of mixing with those whose lineage was from other planets, the mixing and mating among themselves has caused the gene given them by Venus to be watered to the point where it is no longer effective. Most of humanity has by now received enough of this gene that they will eventually open to the light.